A cruel millionaire abandoned his beloved and their child to be with his mistress. 23 years later, he was paralyzed upon seeing her in a luxury hotel with a young man identical to him. Richard stood by the window of his lavish penthouse. The shimmering skyline of New York sprawled out before him. He could feel the weight of the decision looming over him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about guilt or second thoughts. No, this was about a better life, one filled with luxury, excitement, and the kind of indulgence he felt he deserved. His wife, Eleanor, had grown distant, bogged down by their remote life on the farm. She wasn't the vibrant woman he had married. And then there was Ethan, their little boy, with his wide eyes and innocent questions. Richard couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. His gaze flickered toward Jessica, lounging on the expensive leather sofa. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: glamorous, lively, unpredictable. Jessica didn't want to talk about mundane things like crops or the weather. She wanted to jet off to exotic places, drink champagne on yachts, and attend exclusive parties. She was freedom wrapped in designer silk. "I can't keep pretending," Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "You don't have to." Jessica's voice was smooth, dripping with confidence. "Eleanor is holding you back. You've outgrown that life, Richard. It's time to move on." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Richard had spent years trying to convince himself that his marriage would get better, that he could rekindle whatever connection he once had with Eleanor. But the truth was, he had changed, and so had she. The farm life no longer appealed to him, nor did the quiet simplicity of family dinners or the responsibilities of fatherhood. Richard turned away from the window, grabbing his suitcase from the corner of the room. It was already packed, a silent testament to his decision. No more delays, no more second thoughts. He had booked the flight to Los Angeles for the following morning, where Jessica had connections that could change everything. They would start fresh, away from the farm, from Eleanor, and from Ethan. As Richard zipped up the suitcase, a wave of unease washed over him. For a brief moment, he thought of Eleanor standing on the porch of their farmhouse, watching as his car drove away. He imagined Ethan running after the car, calling out for his father. His chest tightened, but he quickly buried the feeling. "It's for the best," he told himself. "I can't live that life anymore." Jessica rose from the couch and glided toward him, her manicured hand sliding over his shoulder. "Don't look back, Richard. You're doing the right thing." He nodded, though the pit in his stomach remained. The truth was, he hadn't even told Eleanor. There had been no argument, no confrontation. He'd simply stopped answering her calls, stopped visiting the farm. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid. But she had no idea the decision was already made. Richard knew Eleanor was too proud to beg him to stay, but deep down, he also knew she would be heartbroken. He could picture her sitting by the old piano in their living room, fingers hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play the melancholy tune that always reflected her mood when things weren't right. It had been years since she performed, and that passion, the one thing that had connected them in the early days, seemed to have disappeared entirely. Now, it was all about survival on that lonely farm. Jessica's grip tightened, pulling him out of his thoughts. "You've got a plane to catch." Without another word, Richard grabbed the suitcase, the final act that severed him from his past. He wasn't going to be the man tied to a rural life, surrounded by chores and responsibilities. No more chickens to feed, no more crops to tend, no more dull conversations about the weather. He glanced at Jessica one last time before heading to the door. Her smile was bright, full of promise, but it was nothing compared to the warmth Eleanor used to give him. Still, it was easier this way. Jessica didn't ask for more than he was willing to give, and that was all he needed. Outside, the city lights reflected in his car's windshield as he sped through the streets, leaving behind the quiet life Eleanor and Ethan still clung to. The farm was hundreds of miles away, but he could already feel the distance growing in his heart. He imagined the moment when Eleanor would realize he wasn't coming back, her world crumbling without explanation. But that wasn't his problem anymore. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. Eleanor stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her gaze lost in the distant horizon where the sky met the rolling fields. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, but she barely noticed. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the silence that had become all too familiar in recent months. The phone calls from Richard had stopped weeks ago, and despite her attempts to reach him, there was no answer. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't been prepared for the truth that would soon hit her. The door creaked as Ethan came out, holding a small toy truck in his hand. "Mama, when is Daddy coming home?" he asked, his wide, innocent eyes looking up at her with hope. Eleanor's chest tightened. She bent down and brushed his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetie," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince more, Ethan or herself. Every day that passed without word from Richard felt like another step deeper into a reality she didn't want to face. It had been clear for a long time that their marriage wasn't what it used to be, but Eleanor had held on to the hope that they could find a way back to each other. She had given up so much for him, her career, her dreams of becoming a renowned pianist. She had traded the stage for a life in the country, raising their son and managing the farm while Richard pursued his business ventures. But now, the silence was deafening. Eleanor stood up and took a deep breath, forcing herself to look at the world around her. The farm was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. It had always been a place of peace, but lately it felt like a prison. She could feel the weight of the responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders, the bills, the upkeep, and the constant worry about how she would manage everything on her own if Richard wasn't coming back. How would they survive? As she walked inside, Ethan followed closely behind, tugging at her sleeve. "Can we have pancakes for dinner?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Sure, pancakes sound perfect," she replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. Ethan deserved more than the sadness she was carrying. He was just a child, and she needed to shield him from the truth for as long as she could. The kitchen was small but cozy, filled with the remnants of the life they had once built together. Eleanor pulled out the ingredients for pancakes, her mind wandering as she measured flour and cracked eggs. She remembered the early days when she and Richard had first moved to the farm. They had been full of excitement, eager to start a family and build something meaningful together. The farm had been their dream. Richard had talked about raising their children in nature, away from the chaos of city life. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Eleanor shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. Dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. She needed to focus on the present, on making sure Ethan was fed and happy. That was all that mattered right now. As they sat down to eat, Eleanor forced herself to engage in light conversation with Ethan, asking about his day and listening to him talk about the toy cars he had been playing with. He was so full of energy and life, unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's heart. Eleanor envied his innocence, the way he still believed that everything would be okay. But as the night crept in and Ethan drifted off to sleep, Eleanor found herself alone with her thoughts once again. She sat by the window, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The farm was quiet, and in that silence, the truth began to settle in her bones. Richard wasn't coming back. She hadn't received any official word from him, but in her heart she knew it was over. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time since Richard's disappearance, she allowed herself to cry. She had been strong for so long, holding everything together, but now, in the solitude of the night, she let the weight of it all crush her. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had abandoned them. The life they had built was nothing more than a memory, and she was left to pick up the pieces. After what felt like hours, Eleanor wiped her eyes and stood up. There was no point in wallowing in sorrow. She had a son to take care of, a farm to run. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. Slowly, she began to steel herself for the reality ahead. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to keep the farm going. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to support Ethan. Tomorrow, she would have to learn how to be both mother and father. It wouldn't be easy, but she had no choice. She had to survive. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the fields as Eleanor struggled to move a heavy sack of feed toward the barn. Her muscles ached, her body unused to the kind of labor that running a farm demanded. The isolation of it all weighed heavily on her, but she refused to give up. Ethan still slept inside the house, and the last thing she wanted was for him to see her struggling. She wanted him to feel safe, to believe that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. As Eleanor reached the barn door, she heard the sound of a truck rumbling down the dirt road. It was an unusual sound. Visitors were rare in this part of the countryside. She turned her head, wiping the sweat from her brow, and watched as an old, beat-up pickup truck came to a stop near the house. Out stepped a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with sun-kissed skin and a calm expression. He wore a well-worn hat, boots caked with dirt, and jeans that had seen better days. Eleanor's guard went up immediately. She wasn't used to strangers coming around, especially not since Richard had left. The man walked toward her, tipping his hat as he approached. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a deep, steady voice. "Name's Michael. I live a few miles down the road. Heard you could use a hand around here." Eleanor hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't one to accept charity, and she certainly wasn't comfortable with the idea of letting a stranger into her life. But the truth was, she did need help. The farm was too much for one person, and with Richard gone, she had no one to turn to. I don't think we need any help," she replied, her voice a little shaky. "But thanks for the offer." Michael didn't budge. He just stood there, his eyes kind but unwavering. "I've seen you working the fields," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a tough job for anyone, let alone someone trying to do it all alone. I've been a farmer my whole life, and I know how it is." Eleanor bit her lip, glancing at the sack of feed she had just dropped. She was tired, exhausted really, and the idea of having help, even for a little while, was tempting. But she wasn't sure if she could trust this man. Still, something about his demeanor put her at ease. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a genuine willingness to lend a hand. "I guess I could use some help with the heavier work," she admitted, her pride taking a small hit. Michael nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I'm not here to get in your way, ma'am. Just thought I could make things a little easier for you." Eleanor let out a sigh and gestured toward the barn. "Well, if you're offering, I could use a hand moving that sack of feed inside." Without another word, Michael rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved the heavy bag with ease, his strength evident as he carried it into the barn. Eleanor watched him, her initial skepticism fading. He wasn't just offering help, he was genuinely capable. She couldn't deny that it was a relief to have someone else take on some of the burden. As the morning went on, Michael continued to assist with the farm work. He repaired a broken fence, helped organize the barn, and even managed to get an old tractor running again. Eleanor was amazed by how much they had accomplished in just a few hours, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. Over lunch, they sat together at the small wooden table inside the house. Ethan, now awake and full of energy, babbled on about his toy trucks as Eleanor served them sandwiches. Michael listened patiently, nodding and smiling at Ethan's excitement. Eleanor couldn't help but notice how natural Michael seemed around her son, how at ease he was in their home. "You've been a big help today," Eleanor said as they ate, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." Michael shrugged modestly. "Just glad I could help. I've been in your shoes before. Lost my wife a few years back. Things were tough for a while. I know how it feels to try to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Eleanor looked down at her plate, feeling a pang of empathy for this man she barely knew. She could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just being polite. He had lived through his own hardships, just like she was now. Maybe that's why he had shown up today. Maybe he understood her struggle better than she realized. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "It's hard doing all this alone." Michael gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "It doesn't have to be that way, Eleanor. Sometimes it's okay to let people in. You don't have to do it all on your own." His words struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had been trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together for Ethan. But maybe Michael was right. Maybe she didn't have to carry this burden alone. As the afternoon stretched on, Eleanor found herself opening up more to Michael, sharing bits and pieces of her life on the farm, her love for music, and the dreams she once had of being a concert pianist. He listened without interrupting, and by the time he left that evening, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Michael's arrival had been unexpected, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she needed. The days following Michael's arrival passed in a blur of work, but for the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't feel as though she was drowning. With Michael's help, the farm began to run more smoothly. The fences were mended, the crops tended to, and the weight that had been pressing down on Eleanor's shoulders seemed to lift, if only just a little. Ethan, too, seemed to have grown fond of Michael. He followed him around like a shadow, asking questions about tractors, animals, and anything else that sparked his young mind. One afternoon, after finishing up with the day's chores, Eleanor found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. Michael had gone back to his own farm for the evening, leaving her with some rare quiet time. Inside the house, Ethan was playing with his toy trucks, his happy chatter filling the air. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the peacefulness wash over her. And then, almost unconsciously, her mind drifted to the piano, the one she hadn't touched in years. It sat there in the living room, gathering dust, the same piano that had once been the center of her life, the instrument that had carried her through her teenage years, her college days, and the first years of her marriage. Back then, music had been everything to her. She had spent hours practicing, dreaming of the day she would perform on grand stages in front of large audiences. But those dreams had faded when she married Richard, and they had vanished completely when they moved to the farm. The piano became more of a relic from a past life, something she didn't dare touch, as if playing it again would remind her of all the things she had lost. But now, with the farm finally running smoothly and Ethan happy, something inside her shifted. The thought of playing again didn't seem so far-fetched. In fact, it felt almost necessary. She stood up, walking back inside the house. Ethan barely noticed as she moved past him toward the corner of the living room where the piano stood. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the worn, familiar keys. Could she really do this? Could she rediscover that part of herself? She took a deep breath, letting her fingers press down on the keys. The sound that filled the room was soft, almost hesitant at first, but it stirred something deep within her. The melody, one she had memorized years ago, came back slowly, as though her hands remembered even if her mind had forgotten. The notes flowed from the piano, filling the house with music that hadn't been heard in far too long. As she played, memories of her old life, before the farm, before Richard, before everything, came rushing back. There had been so much hope, so much passion in those days, and even though life had taken a different path, playing the piano again felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Ethan wandered into the living room, his toy truck still in hand, and stood quietly by her side, watching in awe as his mother played. Eleanor glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips, and for the first time in years she felt something close to joy. "Wow, Mama," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide. "You're really good." Eleanor chuckled softly, her fingers never stopping their dance across the keys. "I used to play a lot when I was younger," she explained. "It's been a long time." "Why did you stop?" Ethan asked, his innocent question hanging in the air. Eleanor's smile faltered for just a moment. She had stopped for so many reasons. Richard, the move, the responsibilities of raising a family. But how could she explain all of that to her little boy? "I guess life got busy," she said gently. "But maybe it's time I start again." As the days passed, Eleanor made a point to sit at the piano more often, sometimes playing for hours after Ethan went to bed. The more she played, the more her love for music came rushing back. It wasn't long before Michael noticed the change in her. One evening, after dinner, Eleanor was at the piano again when Michael knocked on the door. Ethan, thrilled to see him, ran to let him in. Michael stepped inside, his eyes catching sight of Eleanor at the piano. "I didn't know you played," he said, leaning against the door frame. Eleanor stopped, a little self-conscious now that she had an audience. "I used to, a long time ago. I guess I'm just rediscovering it." Michael smiled, that easygoing smile of his. "You're good. Really good." Eleanor blushed slightly, not used to receiving compliments anymore, especially about something that had once been such a private passion. "Thanks," she muttered, her fingers lingering on the keys. "You ever think about playing for other people? You know, like you used to?" Michael asked, his tone casual but curious. Eleanor let out a small laugh. "Oh, I don't know about that. I think those days are behind me." "Why?" "You've got talent, Eleanor. People should hear you play." The thought of performing again had crossed her mind, but it seemed like such a distant possibility. There were bills to pay, a farm to run, a child to raise. But as she sat there, her fingers tracing the smooth ivory keys, she realized that maybe it wasn't as impossible as she thought. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, not wanting to make any promises but feeling a glimmer of hope nonetheless. Michael nodded, understanding that it wasn't something she could decide on the spot. But the seed had been planted. Eleanor felt it too, a small spark of ambition that had been buried for far too long. As the evening wore on, Michael stayed for a while longer, helping Ethan with his homework and chatting with Eleanor about farm work. But even after he left, the piano remained at the forefront of her mind. Eleanor sat at the piano again after Ethan went to bed, this time letting the music flow freely. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for her future. The city lights of New York stretched far and wide, but for Richard, they no longer sparkled with the same allure. He sat slumped at the corner table of a dimly lit bar, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in front of him. The days of lavish parties, extravagant dinners, and VIP treatment were long gone. It had been months since Jessica had walked out on him, leaving him to face the mounting debts, lawsuits, and failed business ventures that were rapidly consuming everything he had built. Richard rubbed his temples, trying to block out the reality that had become his life. He had lost it all. The company he had once proudly helmed, the real estate empire that had made him one of New York's most admired businessmen, was gone. He had made bad deals, risky investments that didn't pay off, and Jessica, ever the opportunist, had left the moment the money stopped flowing. She hadn't even bothered with a proper goodbye, just packed her bags and vanished. The truth was, he had seen it coming. There had been signs, her growing disinterest, the late-night phone calls, the subtle hints that she was looking for something else, someone else. But Richard had chosen to ignore them, just like he had ignored Eleanor's calls when he left her behind on the farm. The bartender, a middle-aged man who had seen one too many customers drown their sorrows at his counter, came over and eyed Richard with mild sympathy. "You need a refill?" he asked. Richard shook his head, pushing the glass away. "No, I'm good," he mumbled, though nothing about his situation felt good. He stood up from the bar and tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter, enough to cover his tab. As he made his way to the exit, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The city was loud and vibrant, as it always was, but to Richard it felt distant, like he no longer belonged there. He had never imagined his life would come to this. A year ago he had been on top of the world, rich, admired, and with a beautiful woman on his arm. But all of it had been built on lies, deception, and the shallow pursuit of wealth. The empire he had once been so proud of had collapsed in a matter of months. His bank accounts were frozen, his property seized, and his name dragged through the mud in the press. The final blow had come just a few weeks ago when he had been forced to sell the last of his assets. The only thing left was his apartment, and even that was barely hanging on by a thread. The creditors were closing in, and soon he would be left with nothing but his reputation, one that had been shattered beyond repair. As Richard walked through the crowded streets, his mind wandered back to the farm, back to Eleanor and Ethan. He hadn't thought about them in so long, but now, in the middle of his downfall, they seemed to haunt his every waking moment. What had they done to deserve his abandonment? Eleanor had been nothing but supportive, even when he had decided to chase after Jessica and leave them both behind. And Ethan. Richard couldn't even remember the last time he had seen his son. The boy had probably grown so much by now, but Richard had missed it all. He had missed birthdays, milestones, everything. All for what? For a life of luxury that had proven to be nothing more than an illusion. His feet carried him aimlessly until he found himself standing outside a gleaming hotel. It was one of the high-end places he used to frequent back when money was no object and everything seemed possible. But now, the sight of it only filled him with shame. He had applied for a job there just the other day, not as a guest, but as a janitor. Richard glanced through the glass doors of the hotel, catching a glimpse of the polished marble floors and sparkling chandeliers inside. He had walked those very floors in designer suits, brushing shoulders with the elite, confident and powerful. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow of the man he used to be. The interview had been humiliating. Sitting in a tiny office, dressed in clothes that no longer fit quite right, he had filled out the application, barely able to meet the eyes of the young hotel manager who interviewed him. The manager had looked him over, clearly skeptical that a man like Richard would be willing to mop floors and scrub toilets for a living. But Richard didn't have a choice. He needed the money. There was nowhere else to turn. The job had been offered to him on the spot. The pay was minimal, but it was something. It was enough to keep him afloat, at least for now. Tomorrow would be his first shift. Tomorrow, he would step into a life he had never imagined for himself. Richard took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. This was the consequence of his choices. The women he had pursued, the deals he had made, the family he had abandoned. It was all catching up to him now, and there was no escaping it. The following morning, Richard arrived at the hotel for his first day of work. The uniform they gave him felt foreign on his skin, a far cry from the tailored suits he once wore. He kept his head down, avoiding the eyes of the hotel staff as he grabbed the cleaning supplies and set off to start his shift. As he scrubbed the floors, the reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. This was his life now. No more parties, no more lavish dinners, just him, a mop, and the echoes of his past mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different, something that could teach him the lessons he had so desperately needed to learn. Eleanor sat at her piano, her fingers flowing effortlessly across the keys as the music filled the room. The soft light of the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the small concert hall where she was rehearsing. It had been years since she had felt this alive, this connected to her true self. The melodies she played seemed to carry her beyond the weight of her responsibilities, lifting her above the hardships she had faced. She had come so far since those dark days on the farm when the weight of Richard's abandonment had crushed her spirit. Now, instead of struggling to survive, she was thriving. Her name was known, her music celebrated in local circles, and invitations to play at events and small concerts had started to pour in. The community had embraced her talent, and with each performance, Eleanor found herself rediscovering the passion that had once defined her. Her success had been gradual but steady, thanks in no small part to Michael. He had encouraged her every step of the way, always reminding her of the gift she had buried for so long. He had taken on more of the farm work, giving Eleanor the freedom to focus on her music again, and Ethan, who was now in school, was thriving as well. Their life had become one of balance and joy, a far cry from the lonely struggle Eleanor had faced alone. After her rehearsal, Eleanor stepped off the stage, taking a moment to absorb the feeling of accomplishment. She had a performance that evening, and she could already feel the anticipation building. It wasn't the grand stage she had once dreamed of, but it was a start, and the most important thing was that she was doing what she loved, for herself, for Ethan, and for Michael. Michael had been more than a support in the years since he had entered her life. He had become her partner in every sense of the word. Together they had built something beautiful, a family, a home, and now a future. It wasn't the life she had originally envisioned for herself, but in many ways it was better. There was love, stability, and a shared purpose that filled every day with meaning. As Eleanor gathered her things to head home, she caught sight of Ethan in the hallway, holding Michael's hand as they approached. Her heart swelled at the sight of them, a reminder of the life they had built together. Ethan had grown so much, and he adored Michael, looking up to him as a father figure. It was a bond that filled Eleanor with gratitude every day. "Mama!" Ethan ran toward her, his face lighting up with excitement. "Are you ready for tonight? I told all my friends at school about your concert." Eleanor laughed, bending down to give him a hug. "I'm ready, sweetheart, and I'm glad you're so excited." Michael smiled, his eyes warm as he watched the exchange. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, stepping closer to wrap his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "You're going to be amazing." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence. "Thanks to you," she said softly. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Michael shook his head, his smile widening. "You've always had this in you, Eleanor. I just gave you a little push." It was true. Michael had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. He had been there day after day, helping her rediscover the part of her that had been buried for so long. And now, as she prepared for yet another performance, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. Later that evening, as the concert hall filled with the quiet murmur of the audience, Eleanor stood backstage, nerves fluttering in her stomach. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was her moment. She had worked hard to get here, and no matter what happened, she had already won. She had reclaimed her music, her passion, and her life. The lights dimmed, and the announcer's voice echoed through the hall, introducing her to the waiting crowd. Eleanor stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, all the nervousness melted away. The music took over, flowing from her fingertips with a grace and ease that felt like coming home. The audience was silent, captivated by the beauty of her performance. Eleanor's eyes remained closed as she played, losing herself in the music. This was where she belonged, and she knew it now more than ever. The years of hardship, the sacrifices she had made, all of it had led her to this moment. And as she played the final notes, a wave of emotion washed over her. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Eleanor stood and bowed, her heart swelling with gratitude. In the front row, she spotted Michael and Ethan, their faces beaming with pride. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. After the concert, as the audience filtered out and the stagehands began to clear the space, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers. People congratulated her, praising her talent and the beauty of her performance. It was a humbling experience, one that made her realize just how far she had come. But amid the celebration, it was Michael and Ethan who stood out the most. They were her family, the ones who had been there through it all. Michael wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice filled with admiration. Eleanor smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." Later that night, as they drove back to the farm, Eleanor looked out at the darkened fields, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had built a new life, one that was filled with love, music, and the promise of a future she had once thought impossible. And as they pulled into the driveway, Eleanor realized that for the first time in a long time, she was truly happy. Richard wiped the sweat from his brow as he pushed the mop across the hotel lobby floor. The once polished marble, now a sea of dirty footprints left by guests bustling in and out. He hated this job. Every swipe of the mop reminded him of the life he'd lost, the wealth, the power, the sense of importance. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, forgotten and overlooked. The hotel's grandeur mocked him. The chandeliers above sparkled like the life he once lived, so close yet utterly out of reach. Each day was a grim reminder of the choices that had led him here. He had traded his family for Jessica, for what he thought was a better life, and it had all crumbled. He hadn't seen or heard from Eleanor in years, and he tried not to think about Ethan, the son he had abandoned. Guilt gnawed at him, but there was no going back now. All he could do was keep his head down and get through the day. The lobby was busy with guests checking in, couples heading to dinner, and families preparing for a night out in the city. Richard kept to himself, avoiding eye contact, blending into the background like the furniture. His life had become a routine of mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and taking out trash. It was humiliating, but it was all he had. As he rounded the corner, pushing his cleaning cart along with him, he glanced up and froze in place. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Standing at the far end of the lobby, looking radiant and poised, was Eleanor. Time seemed to slow down as Richard stared, unable to process what he was seeing. She was older, of course, but the years had been kind to her. She stood there gracefully, holding the hand of a man who was clearly not Richard. Next to them was a young boy, not much younger than Ethan had been the last time Richard had seen him. And then, as his eyes shifted, they landed on a young man, tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence. His heart clenched painfully as he realized it was Ethan. They were all together: Eleanor, Ethan, and the man Richard didn't know, the man who must have replaced him. The mop slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of regret. He had never imagined he would see them again, especially not like this, happy, successful, without him. Eleanor didn't notice him at first. She was busy checking in at the front desk, laughing softly with Ethan and the man by her side. But then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, neither of them moved. The recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by a mix of surprise and something else. Pity, maybe? Richard's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came out. The years of silence, of running away from his mistakes, had caught up with him in this single moment, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of his failures. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer before she looked away, turning back to Ethan and the man. She didn't rush to confront him, didn't make a scene. Instead, she carried on with her conversation as if he were nothing more than a stranger passing by. But to Richard, it felt like a punch to the gut. He stood there, rooted in place, watching as Eleanor and her new family moved toward the elevators. Ethan glanced back briefly, his eyes brushing over Richard without a hint of recognition. It was as if he didn't even remember his own father. And why would he? Richard had been gone for so long, leaving nothing but an empty space in Ethan's life. The elevator doors slid shut, and just like that, they were gone. Richard stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Eleanor looked happy, happier than he had ever seen her when they were together. The man by her side, with his arm around her, clearly loved her. They had a family now, one that didn't include him. The pain hit him harder than he expected. He had always known that Eleanor would move on, that she would find someone better than him, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. He had never felt more alone, more worthless than in that moment. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "Hey, are you going to finish cleaning, or just stand there?" Richard blinked and turned to see the hotel manager staring at him with an annoyed expression. Without another word, he picked up the mop and continued working, though his hands trembled and his mind was far away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Richard went through the motions, cleaning, scrubbing, doing what was expected of him, but his mind was elsewhere, back with Eleanor, back with Ethan, back to the life he had thrown away. He had no idea what to do next, no idea if he should even try to reach out to her. What could he possibly say after all these years, after all the pain he had caused? As he clocked out and walked back to his small, dingy apartment that night, the image of Eleanor and her new family haunted him. He had missed so much, Ethan growing up, the life they had built without him. And now, seeing them happy, successful, and complete without him only magnified the emptiness he felt inside. Richard knew deep down that there was no going back. The life he had destroyed could never be rebuilt. But for the first time, he wondered if there was still a chance, however small, for redemption. Maybe, just maybe, he could make things right, even if he could never truly be part of their lives again. Richard barely slept that night, his mind consumed by the image of Eleanor and Ethan. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. 4 years, he had pushed thoughts of his old life away, burying them under the weight of his ambition and greed. But now, after seeing them so unexpectedly, it was all he could think about. By the time the sun began to rise, Richard had made up his mind. He had to speak to Eleanor. He couldn't go on like this, living with the regret, the guilt, the what-ifs. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he had to try. He had to face the consequences of his choices, no matter how painful. The next day, Richard returned to the hotel, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't worked up the courage to ask around about Eleanor's room number, so he waited in the lobby, pacing nervously near the elevator. Each time the doors opened, he held his breath, hoping it would be her. Hours passed, and doubt began to creep in. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had already left, taking her new life with her and leaving him behind once again? The thought made his stomach churn, but he refused to leave. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the elevator doors opened, and there she was. Eleanor stepped out, looking radiant as ever, though the weight of their shared history hung between them like a thick fog. She paused when she saw him standing there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension thick in the air. "Eleanor," Richard finally said, his voice shaky and low. "Can we talk?" She didn't respond right away, her eyes studying him with a mixture of surprise and caution. Richard could see the weariness in her gaze, the hesitation, the memories of all he had done to her. "Please," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to talk to you." Eleanor let out a slow breath, her expression softening slightly. "After what felt like an eternity," she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's talk." They stepped outside the hotel, the cool autumn air brushing against their skin. They found a small bench in a nearby park, away from the bustle of the city. Richard sat down first, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Eleanor sat beside him, but there was a distance between them that felt like a chasm. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Richard struggled to find the words, unsure of where to even begin. How could he explain himself? How could he possibly make up for everything he had done? "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. For everything. For leaving you, for abandoning Ethan." His words caught in his throat, and he swallowed hard. "I was selfish. I was a coward." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, listening as Richard poured his heart out. "I thought I wanted something more," he continued, his voice trembling. "I thought the money, the luxury, all of it would make me happy. But it didn't. It ruined everything. I lost everything. And now I see you, and you've built this incredible life without me. I don't blame you for moving on, for finding happiness. But I can't stop thinking about what I threw away." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Richard, it wasn't just about the money. You left because you wanted a different life, and that's fine. But you didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from Ethan, too." Richard winced at the mention of his son. It was the deepest wound, the one that hurt the most. He had abandoned Ethan, left him without a father, all because of his own greed. "I know," he whispered. "I know. I don't deserve his forgiveness, or yours. But I'm asking you anyway. Not to forget what I did, but to at least forgive me." Eleanor's gaze softened, her eyes reflecting a sadness that mirrored his own. "Richard, I've spent years trying to make peace with what happened. I've rebuilt my life. Ethan has grown into a wonderful young man. And Michael has been there for both of us." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I can see that. I saw you all together, and it's clear how happy you are. You deserve that, Eleanor. You deserve all the happiness in the world." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. "I do forgive you, Richard," she said softly. "Not for you, but for me. Holding on to that pain, that anger. It wasn't helping anyone. And I'm in a different place now. I have a new life. But that doesn't mean the hurt just goes away." Her words were like a balm to his wounded soul, though they carried a bittersweet edge. She had moved on, truly moved on, and there was no place for him in her life any more. He had known that deep down, but hearing it from her made it real. "I don't expect anything from you," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And I wanted to hear you say that you're okay, that you're happy." Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I am happy, Richard. And I hope you can find some peace too." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. It was a strange kind of closure, one filled with both forgiveness and finality. Richard knew that Eleanor's life would continue without him, just as it had for all these years. And though it hurt, he accepted it. "I should go," Eleanor said after a while, standing up. "Take care of yourself, Richard." Richard watched as she turned to leave, her figure growing smaller as she walked back toward the hotel. He sat there for a long time after she was gone, the cool air nipping at his skin. He had come seeking forgiveness, and he had found it. But the emptiness inside him remained. As he stood up and began to walk away, Richard realized that he still had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Eleanor walked away from Richard, her heart a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The encounter had dredged up feelings she had long buried, but now, as she moved farther from him, she realized how much she had healed. The man she had once loved, the man she had built her life with, was now just a shadow from the past. He was no longer the center of her world, and for that she was grateful. The city streets were bustling as Eleanor made her way back to the hotel. Michael and Ethan were probably wondering where she had gone, but she needed those few moments alone to process everything. Richard's plea for forgiveness had been heartfelt, but it wasn't the words that struck her. It was the look in his eyes, the guilt, the regret, the weight of his mistakes. Eleanor knew those feelings well. She had carried them for years, thinking she had done something wrong, that she wasn't enough to keep him. But now she understood that Richard's decisions had nothing to do with her. They had been his alone, and she had finally let go of the need to carry the burden of his choices. As she approached the hotel lobby, she spotted Ethan sitting with Michael by one of the large windows. They were laughing about something, their bond so natural, so real. It warmed her heart to see Ethan so happy, thriving in this life they had created together. Michael had stepped in, not to replace Richard, but to fill the void that Richard had left behind. He had been there for Ethan in ways that Eleanor could never fully express in words, and for that she was endlessly grateful. When Ethan saw her, he jumped up, running toward her with that infectious energy only a young man like him could have. "Mama, where did you go? We were waiting for you." Eleanor smiled, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. "I just needed some fresh air, sweetheart," she said, glancing over at Michael, who was watching her with a knowing look. She could tell he sensed something was different, but he didn't ask. Michael always knew when to give her space. "You ready to head out?" Michael asked, standing up and stretching. "The concert hall is not far, but we don't want to be late." Eleanor nodded, smoothing a hand over Ethan's hair. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked through the city streets toward the concert hall, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation with Richard had given her a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Forgiving him hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for him, but for her own peace. Holding on to that anger, that pain, had weighed her down for far too long. Michael walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers. She slipped her fingers into his, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. He had always been enough. From the moment he had come into her life, he had been the steady force she didn't realize she needed. Ethan walked ahead of them, his excitement about the evening bubbling over in every step. "Mama, I can't wait to see you perform tonight. Do you think there will be a lot of people there?" Eleanor smiled at his enthusiasm. "I think so, sweetheart. It's going to be a great night." The concert hall loomed ahead of them, its lights bright against the evening sky. As they stepped inside, Eleanor felt the familiar rush of nerves that always came before a performance. But this time it wasn't fear, it was excitement. She was doing what she loved, and she had her family by her side. That was all that mattered. Backstage, as Eleanor prepared for the performance, she found a moment to herself, gazing into the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked calm, confident, and sure of herself. It was a far cry from the person she had been all those years ago when Richard had walked out of her life. She had been broken then, unsure of her future, unsure of how she would survive. But now she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. It was one of the stagehands, letting her know it was almost time. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothing her dress before walking toward the stage. As she stepped out into the bright lights, the applause from the audience filled the hall, a hum of energy that settled her nerves. She took her seat at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, and for a brief moment she thought of Richard, not with anger or regret, but with compassion. He had been a part of her journey, a chapter in her life that had shaped who she was. But he was no longer the center of her story. This was her moment now, her future, her happiness. The first notes of her performance filled the air, and Eleanor lost herself in the music. It was as if the world outside the concert hall had faded away, leaving only the piano, the audience, and her. Every chord, every melody flowed from her heart, carrying with it the emotions of the past and the hope of the future. As the final note echoed through the hall, the audience erupted in applause. Eleanor stood and bowed, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She glanced toward the front row, where Michael and Ethan were standing, clapping louder than anyone else. Her family, her home. After the concert, as people filtered out and congratulated her, Eleanor found herself smiling, not just because of the success of the performance, but because of the peace she had found within herself. She had forgiven Richard, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the weight of the past. Later, as they walked back to their hotel, Ethan chatted excitedly about the concert, and Michael slipped his arm around Eleanor's waist. The night air was cool, but Eleanor felt warm, wrapped in the love of the people who mattered most to her. As they reached their room, Eleanor paused, taking in the quiet peace of the moment. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at Michael. "For what?" he asked, smiling. "For everything," she replied, leaning into him. "For helping me find my way back to myself." Michael kissed her forehead gently. "You did that all on your own, Eleanor. I was just lucky enough to be along for the ride." Eleanor smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had come so far, and the road ahead was still full of possibilities. But now, with her family by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The echo of Eleanor's voice stayed with Richard long after their conversation ended. He had spent the night wandering the streets of New York, unsure of where to go or what to do. The forgiveness he had sought from Eleanor was bittersweet. It offered him relief, but at the same time, it underscored the reality of how much he had truly lost. He had been forgiven, yes, but he hadn't been welcomed back. There would be no reunion with the family he had abandoned. There was no way to undo the years of absence, no way to be a part of their lives again. The closure Eleanor had given him was real, but it also served as a final reminder that his past was behind him, locked away, and he had no place in her future. By the time Richard reached his small apartment, the sun was already creeping over the skyline. The apartment was a far cry from the luxurious spaces he used to inhabit. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, and the silence was deafening. This was all he had now, the result of his ambition and greed. Once upon a time, he had everything: a family, a fortune, and a future full of possibilities. Now, he had nothing but memories and regrets. As he stood by the small window, looking out over the city that had once felt like his playground, Richard couldn't help but think about all the choices that had led him here. He had always believed that success was measured by wealth, by how many people admired you, by how much you could control. He had chased power, indulged in luxuries, and believed that the more he had, the happier he would be. But that illusion had shattered long ago. Richard turned away from the window, sinking into the worn-out chair in the corner of the room. He had spent years running from his mistakes, pretending that they didn't matter, that he could outrun the consequences of abandoning his family. But now, sitting alone in this empty apartment, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Eleanor had moved on, built a new life, and found happiness with Michael and their children. Richard had seen it in her eyes, in the way she had spoken to him with calm and certainty. She wasn't angry anymore. She had let go. But she had also made it clear that her new life didn't have room for him. And Ethan. The thought of his son twisted a knife in Richard's heart. He had barely recognized the young man who had stood beside Eleanor in the hotel lobby. Ethan had grown so much, and Richard hadn't been there to witness any of it. He hadn't seen his son grow up, hadn't been there for birthdays, for milestones, for anything. The boy who had once idolized him now didn't even know him. Richard had become a stranger in his own son's life. The guilt was crushing. Richard had tried to ignore it for years, pushing it down, telling himself that he had made the right choice by pursuing a different life. But seeing Ethan again had shattered that delusion. He had abandoned his own child, and no amount of success or money could ever make up for that. But what hurt the most wasn't the realization of what he had lost. It was the understanding that he could never get it back. There was no second chance with Ethan. Even if he reached out, even if he tried to make amends, it would never be the same. He had missed too much, and Ethan had grown up without him. Richard leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. How had he let it get this far? How had he become so blind to what really mattered? He had thought he was chasing happiness, but all along he had been running from it. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to truly reflect on the man he had become. He had spent so long believing that power and wealth were the only things that mattered. But in the end, they had left him empty and alone. The success he had craved had come at the cost of the people he loved most. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. None of it had been worth it. Not the money, not the parties, not the prestige. He had traded everything that really mattered for a hollow life of luxury that had crumbled the moment things got tough. Richard stood up, pacing the small room. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here drowning in regret. But what could he do? Eleanor had made it clear that their lives had diverged, and Ethan probably didn't even remember him. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He had to try. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could try to make peace with it. The next day, Richard found himself standing outside a small cafe near Central Park, where Eleanor had once mentioned she liked to bring Ethan when they visited the city. It was a long shot, but he had no other plan. He didn't expect a warm reception. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Ethan would want to see him. But he had to try. As the hours passed, Richard sat at one of the outdoor tables, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He watched the people pass by. Families, couples, children laughing and playing in the park. Each face was a reminder of the life he had given up, the family he had lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw them. Eleanor, Michael, Ethan, and their younger child were walking toward the park, smiling and laughing together. Richard's heart clenched at the sight. They looked so happy, so complete. He knew he didn't belong there, but something inside him urged him to stand up, to try. Eleanor spotted him first. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but then she gave him a small nod. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was permission to be there, even if he was no longer part of their lives. Ethan glanced over, his expression unreadable. Richard's heart ached as he watched his son, now nearly a man, walk past without a word. But this time, it didn't crush him. This time, he understood. Ethan didn't owe him anything. He had built a life without his father, and Richard had to accept that. But as Eleanor and her family continued walking, something shifted inside Richard. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start by accepting the consequences. He had asked for forgiveness, and now he had to forgive himself, not for leaving, but for the years he had wasted running from the truth. Richard stayed at the cafe until long after they were gone, the weight of his reflections settling over him like a quiet rain. He wasn't the man he used to be, and perhaps that was the most important step he could take, understanding that he had to change, and that redemption didn't come with a grand gesture, but with small steps. As he stood up and walked toward the park, the city alive with the sounds of life around him, Richard felt something unfamiliar stir inside him: hope. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself reflecting more and more on his encounter with Eleanor and Ethan. The pain of seeing them happy without him still lingered, but it had also sparked something inside him, a desire to change, to rebuild his life from the ashes of his mistakes. He knew that redemption wouldn't come easily, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face the future rather than hide from it. He threw himself into his work at the hotel, no longer seeing it as a punishment, but as a chance to prove to himself that he could be more than the man who had lost everything. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and Richard began to find a certain peace in the routine. Every day, he worked quietly and diligently, and though the other employees barely noticed him, he took pride in doing the job well. It wasn't just about earning a paycheck anymore. It was about rebuilding his sense of self-worth. For too long, Richard had measured his value by his wealth and status, but now he was learning that true worth came from within. He had spent so many years chasing after external validation, but now he was beginning to understand that the person he needed to prove something to was himself. One day, as Richard finished his shift and headed out of the hotel, he felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. He had made peace with the fact that he couldn't go back, and now he was focused on moving forward, no matter how slowly. Walking through the streets of New York, he found himself wandering toward Central Park, a place that had become a sort of refuge for him in recent weeks. The park was alive with activity: families picnicking, children playing, people jogging along the paths. It was a reminder of the life that continued all around him, even as he rebuilt his own. As he reached a quiet bench near the edge of the park, Richard sat down and gazed out at the people passing by. His thoughts drifted to Eleanor, to Ethan, and to the life he had lost. But instead of bitterness or regret, he felt a sense of acceptance. They had moved on, and so had he. Eleanor had forgiven him, and now it was time to forgive himself. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when someone approached the bench. It wasn't until the familiar sound of footsteps stopped in front of him that Richard looked up, his breath catching in his throat. It was Ethan. The young man stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression cautious but not unkind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, he had no idea what to say. "Hi, Dad," Ethan said, his voice steady but hesitant. Richard swallowed hard, the word Dad hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. He hadn't heard Ethan call him that in so many years, and hearing it now, after everything that had happened, felt like both a gift and a reminder of all the time they had lost. "Hi, Ethan," Richard replied, his voice hoarse. Ethan glanced down at the ground for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "I saw you at the cafe the other day. I didn't know if I should say anything, but I guess I just wanted to see if you were okay." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Of all the things he had expected, this wasn't one of them. He had assumed that Ethan wouldn't want anything to do with him, that the distance between them was too great to bridge. But here he was, standing in front of him, offering something Richard had never dared hope for, a chance. I'm trying to be," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I wasn't there for you, Ethan, and I can never make up for that. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I spent a long time being angry at you," he said, his tone measured. "You left, and for a while I didn't understand why. I guess I still don't, not completely." Richard opened his mouth to explain, but Ethan raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not asking you to explain it," he continued. "I've already made peace with it. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. I've seen how happy Mom is now, with Michael, with the life we've built. And I guess I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone, least of all me." Richard felt a surge of emotion welling up inside him. He wanted to reach out, to tell Ethan how much he regretted every moment he had missed, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. All he could do was listen and hope that in some small way they could find a way forward. "I don't expect anything from you," Ethan added, his voice softening. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Ethan. That means more to me than you'll ever know." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Richard wanted to say so much more, to ask Ethan about his life, to find some way to reconnect. But he knew that this was a delicate moment, and he didn't want to push too hard. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally spoke again. "I'm meeting up with Mom and Michael soon," he said, glancing toward the park. "But maybe we can talk sometime. You know, catch up." Richard's heart soared at the offer. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild the relationship he had lost with his son. "I'd like that," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd really like that." Ethan gave him a small smile, a gesture that felt like a lifeline in the midst of the storm that had been Richard's life. Then, with a nod, he turned and walked toward the park, leaving Richard standing there, watching him go. As Ethan disappeared into the crowd, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had been given a second chance, not just with Ethan, but with himself. It wasn't much, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he could breathe again. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Step by step, moment by moment, he would rebuild his life, no longer defined by the mistakes of his past, but by the hope of what could still be. As he walked away from the park, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Richard smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet.